The moment the officer's hand struck her face, everything shifted in that courtroom. It wasn't just the sting of the slap that left people stunned, it was the way it came out of nowhere. Delivered against a woman who had not raised her voice, had not resisted, had not threatened anyone. She had only asked a question, a simple attempt to understand what was being said about her case. But instead of receiving an answer, she received violence. And the sound of that slap became the spark that lit an unexpected fire in everyone present. It was the kind of moment that makes people rethink the balance of power. And him standing just a few feet away saw it happen with his own eyes. He wasn't a stranger to the courtroom. He knew how officers could act, but he had never seen anything escalate so quickly over something so small. Asterisk. The officer's hand moved almost without thought, and the woman's head tilted slightly from the force. For a second, even she looked stunned, as if she couldn't quite believe it had happened. The room fell quiet, and every eye turned to her. Some witnesses leaned forward in their seats, others froze in shock, and still others glanced nervously at the judge, waiting to see if any order would be restored. Yet the judge stayed seated, saying nothing. Him watching carefully noticed the absence of command in that moment, as if authority itself had disappeared from the bench. The officer who had struck her stood rigid, trying to appear justified in what he had done. But the silence in the room didn't give him the approval he had expected. Asterisk for her. The slap didn't end with humiliation, it began something else. She straightened her shoulders and stared at the officer, then at the judge, as though daring anyone to say that what had just happened was right. The redness still visible on her cheek wasn't weakness. It was evidence. Evidence that she had been wronged in a place that was supposed to protect fairness. Him sitting there felt an unshakable discomfort rise in his chest. He knew that this single act had changed the meaning of everything else that would follow. Asterisk. People often talk about sparks in metaphorical terms, but here the spark was literal. The sharp sound, the visible mark, the quick escalation. It was the kind of action that made those watching realize how fragile the line between law and abuse could be. Him, watching with unblinking eyes, felt the courtroom hold its breath. Everyone knew what they had just seen, and no one could deny it. The slap couldn't be excused as misunderstanding. It couldn't be softened by words. It was there, loud, undeniable. A violation that sat in the air. Asterisk. What made it worse was how quickly it had been delivered. How little thought went into it. How natural the officer seemed to find it. Him noticed this more than anyone else. The lack of hesitation. The absence of control. It was almost routine, as if the officer believed striking a woman in that room carried no consequences. That belief revealed more about the system than any legal argument ever could. And for the woman who stood at the center of it, the question was no longer just about her case. The slap had turned her into a symbol before she had even realized it. Asterisk. Him, sitting only a few feet away, studied the reaction of others. Some shook their heads but stayed seated, unwilling to confront the uniform that had done it. Others whispered, as if lowering their voices could protect them from being the next target of authority. And then there were a few who simply stared at her, waiting to see how she would respond. Him was one of those people, silently watching her every move. Knowing that her reaction would define the meaning of that slap for everyone else in the room. Asterisk. Instead of breaking down, instead of shrinking away, she adjusted her stance and looked directly toward the bench. The very place that was supposed to guarantee her fairness had failed her, and she seemed to know it. The slap had not silenced her, it had woken her. And him, in that instant, understood something that made his heart tighten. This was not about a single officer losing control. This was about what happens when unchecked power believes it will never be challenged. Asterisk. The slap was the spark. It was the moment that shifted the balance of the courtroom, the trigger that exposed the thin veil of authority covering raw force. Him would later recall how everything felt heavier after that instant. The silence, the stares, the awareness that a line had been crossed and could not be unseen. What came next was extraordinary, but it was that single strike that made it possible. Without it, the day would have passed as routine, unremarkable, another case on the docket. But because of it, the courtroom became something else. A stage where humiliation gave way to defiance, and where everyone, including him, witnessed what it meant for power to be questioned in the very place it believed itself untouchable. When she rose from where she stood and began walking toward the bench, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted in ways that were almost impossible to describe. Moments earlier, she had been the one standing defenseless, slapped in front of everyone, humiliated by the very system that was supposed to provide justice. But now, with each step she took toward the judge's seat, that humiliation seemed to transform into something else. Authority, which had been unquestioned and fixed, suddenly looked fragile. Him, watching from his place in the gallery, felt his breath catch. He couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, but he also couldn't look away. Asterisk. Her steps weren't hurried, nor were they timid. They were measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial in their pace. It was as though she understood that the weight of what she was doing required a certain calmness, a refusal to appear reckless. Him noticed that the officer who had struck her didn't move to stop her, though his hand twitched as if he wasn't sure whether to act. The bailiffs glanced at one another, waiting for the judge to bark out some order, but none came. The room seemed suspended in time, as if everyone was waiting to see whether she would really go through with it. Asterisk, and then she did. She reached the bench, climbed the short wooden steps, and without hesitation lowered herself into the judge's chair. Him could feel the collective gasp ripple through the gallery, but what struck him even more was the silence that followed. It wasn't the silence of indifference, but the kind of silence that follows a revelation. She didn't shout, didn't slam her hands on the desk, didn't mock the robe that still hung unused a few feet away. She simply sat there, upright, her hands resting on the bench, her chin held high. She had taken the seat that symbolized power, not through violence or trickery, but through the audacity of her presence. Asterisk for him, it was as if the roles in the room had reversed in an instant. The judge, who moments before embodied unquestioned authority, now looked diminished, watching helplessly as the woman occupied his chair. The officer, who had assumed that his uniform gave him dominance over her, now seemed unsure of himself. His earlier aggression turned into hesitation. The bailiffs, who normally enforced every inch of courtroom order, waited for guidance that never came. And at the center of it all was her, sitting in a place no one would have imagined for her, a place she had claimed without permission but with undeniable force of will. Asterisk, what made it even more powerful was her silence. She didn't need to say a word. Him realized in that moment that words would have less impact than what she had already done. Her act was symbolic in a way no speech could capture. The same seat from which judgments were handed down, where sentences were pronounced and futures decided, was now occupied by the very person who had just been wronged in front of them all. Her calmness wasn't weakness, it was defiance dressed in dignity. Asterisk him felt something stir inside him, a recognition that what he was witnessing was not just about her, but about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or treated as though their voice didn't matter. The courtroom, normally a place where rules and hierarchies were enforced without question, now stood as a stage for resistance. By sitting in that chair, she had reversed the power dynamic in the most unexpected way. She had taken what was supposed to belong only to authority and used it to expose the emptiness of the authority that had failed her. Asterisk, the officer shifted uneasily, his earlier confidence draining with every passing second. Him caught the look in the officer's eyes. It wasn't anger anymore, but something closer to fear. Fear of what this act meant, fear of how it would be remembered. Fear that his slap had not silenced her, but instead elevated her into a symbol larger than either of them. The judge's face was pale, his lips pressed tight, as though he knew that no command he gave now would erase the image burned into everyone's mind. Asterisk for those sitting in the gallery, and for him in particular, it was a lesson unfolding in real time. The woman had not used force. She had not retaliated with violence. Yet her act carried more weight than any physical resistance could. It was a simple gesture that spoke louder than outrage. You cannot strike someone into silence. Not when their presence alone can claim the highest seat in the room. Him knew he would never forget the sight of her hands resting calmly on that bench, the place where laws were spoken and enforced. It was as though for that brief moment, the law itself had been reclaimed by the one it had just failed. Asterisk, her time in that chair lasted only minutes, but it stretched in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. Him felt it, especially it, was as if he had seen authority exposed for what it truly was. Something that could be challenged, something that could be occupied, something that could be taken back by those it tried to suppress. And though the bailiffs eventually moved toward her, and though the judge eventually cleared his throat as if to restore order, none of that mattered. What mattered was that, in those seconds, the balance of power had been reversed before their eyes. The moment she settled into the judge's chair, the silence that followed was unlike anything him had ever experienced in a courtroom. It wasn't filled with whispers or hurried exchanges. It was heavy, suffocating, and thick with meaning. Everyone seemed frozen, as though they understood instinctively that something irreversible had taken place. And yet, what made the moment extraordinary wasn't rage or shouting, it was her quiet stillness. She didn't lash out, didn't scream about injustice, didn't demand apologies. She sat with a composure that unsettled the very people who moments before had believed they controlled the room. Him, staring intently, realized that silence had become her weapon, and it cut deeper than any words could. Asterisk, she didn't need to raise her voice because her presence said everything. The redness still visible on her cheek spoke louder than outrage. Her calm demeanor turned what could have been dismissed as a disruption into something undeniable, a statement that refused to be ignored. Him noticed how the officer who had slapped her avoided her gaze, as if looking at her now would force him to acknowledge what he had done. The judge, still perched awkwardly on the edge of his own authority, shifted uncomfortably but remained mute, and the bailiff strained to step in and assert control stood frozen, waiting for a command that never came. Asterisk, the longer she stayed quiet, the louder her act became. Him could feel it in the stillness of the gallery, in the way no one dared to move or speak. Silence had taken over the room, but it wasn't empty. Silence, it was charged, full of unspoken recognition. Every person there knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. By saying nothing, she forced everyone else to confront their own thoughts. There was no distraction of words to argue with, no heated tone to dismiss as emotional, just her stillness, her dignity, and the weight of the injustice that had brought her to that chair. Asterisk. Him found himself wondering if the officer understood the depth of what he had unleashed. What was meant to intimidate her had instead created a moment that would be remembered far longer than the sting of his hand. In striking her, he had attempted to reduce her, but her silence in that seat magnified her presence in ways he could never have imagined. Hem watched the officer's posture shrink, his shoulders no longer squared with confidence but bent slightly, as though even his uniform couldn't shield him from the power of what had just unfolded. Asterisk. There was something profoundly unsettling in seeing authority undone not by resistance, but by quiet defiance. Him realized that words might have been easier for the system to handle. If she had shouted, she could have been silenced. If she had cursed, she could have been accused of disrespect. But silence was untouchable. It forced those in power to fill in the gaps themselves, to face the reality of what they had allowed to happen. That realization sank heavily into him as he sat in his seat, staring at the woman who had turned stillness into a force stronger than outrage. The gallery felt it too. Him noticed people shifting in their chairs, glancing at one another with expressions that said more than words ever could. Some seemed inspired, their eyes fixed on her as though she embodied a kind of courage they had never seen before. Others looked unsettled, perhaps fearing what such a display of defiance could mean for the order they were used to. But no one looked indifferent, and that was the most telling part. Her silence had left no one untouched. Hem thought about how easily the courtroom could have dismissed her if she had reacted differently. If she had broken down in tears, they might have viewed her as weak. If she had shouted, they could have painted her as unruly. But by remaining calm, she made herself undeniable. She wasn't asking for attention, she was commanding it. She wasn't demanding to be heard, she was proving that she already was. And the more he considered it, the more Him understood that her silence was not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been forced to endure humiliation without recourse. What lingered most for him was the judge's reaction, or rather, the lack of it. The man who should have been the arbiter of fairness sat paralyzed, stripped of the authority his seat was supposed to grant him. That seat, now occupied by the woman, looked more legitimate with her in it than it had moments before when he was presiding. Him saw the shift clearly. Authority no longer rested in the robe or the title, but in the quiet resolve of the one who had been wronged. The silence stretched on, seconds turning into minutes, and with each passing moment, the impact deepened. Him realized that what was happening was not just about a courtroom incident, it was about power itself. Who truly holds it? Is it the person with the badge, the gavel, the title, or is it the one who refuses to bow to any of those symbols when they are used unjustly? The woman, without saying a word, had given the answer, and him, along with everyone else in the room, would carry that answer long after she left the chair. For a long moment, the courtroom seemed trapped in a strange kind of stillness. Every breath measured, every glance weighted with meaning. When she sat in that chair, the symbols everyone thought untouchable, the gavel, the bench, the robe folded neatly on the side, suddenly looked less powerful than the woman herself. Authority no longer belonged to the structures or the titles, it belonged to her presence. Him, watching from his seat, felt the weight of that truth settle over him. It was not just an act of defiance, he had witnessed it was a redefinition of authority itself. A reshaping of who could claim it and why. The judge's chair had always represented a distance between the powerful and the powerless. It was a physical elevation, a reminder that those who sat above had the right to determine the fate of those below. But in that moment, with her sitting there calmly, it became clear that authority could be challenged by dignity just as strongly as by law. Him realized that this wasn't a question of her breaking rules. It was about her exposing the fragility of those rules when enforced without justice. What unsettled him most was how the people around her responded. The officer, who had moments earlier raised his hand as if to prove his control, now stood awkwardly, his earlier certainty stripped away. The bailiffs, usually quick to act, shifted uncomfortably, waiting for a command that didn't come. Even the judge, whose very title should have secured his dominance, looked diminished, his authority hollowed out by his own inaction. It wasn't the gavel or the uniform that determined who held power, it was the courage to sit in the seat when no one expected you to. Him kept thinking about how fast it had all turned. One moment, she had been struck like someone meant to be silenced. The next, she was the figure everyone in the room had to reckon with. Authority had been turned on its head, and he could see how deeply it rattled those who had once held it. The officer's face gave it away most clearly. He avoided her gaze, his earlier confidence drained into something that looked a lot like fear. Him noticed that even the gallery, a mix of strangers who had come for unrelated cases, now sat straighter, as though recognizing they were in the presence of something rare. The longer she stayed in that chair, the more permanent the moment began to feel. It wasn't just a reaction to being slapped, it was a symbolic reclaiming. Authority wasn't something given to her, but something she claimed in the face of injustice. Him thought of all the times he had watched court proceedings before, how routine they had seemed, how unquestioned the roles always were. And yet here, Before his eyes, the entire structure had been reversed. The one expected to be submissive had become the figure of command. What stayed with him most wasn't the shock of her action, but the clarity it brought. He realized that true authority doesn't come from titles or uniforms. It comes from moral ground, from the ability to stand or, in her case, sit where others dare not. The officer had believed the slap would reduce her. The judge had believed silence would control her. Instead, she turned both into proof that their power could be exposed as fragile. Him knew then that what she had done couldn't be undone, not even if she was removed from the chair seconds later. In the gallery, people whispered cautiously, but no one laughed. No one dismissed her. Him noticed admiration in some faces, awe in others, and unease in those tied closest to the system. The atmosphere had shifted permanently. By claiming that chair, she had left a mark not only on the courtroom but on everyone who bore witness. It was as though she had asked, without speaking, who decides who is worthy of authority, and why should we accept it unquestioningly? The officer looked down, fiddling with the edge of his belt, unable to meet her steady gaze. Him caught that moment and understood its meaning. The one who had tried to assert power through force was now powerless in the presence of calm defiance. Authority had been redefined right there in front of him, stripped of its usual shields, and rebuilt in the form of her quiet resolve. Him would carry that image with him long after leaving the courtroom, the sight of her hands resting firmly on the bench, her eyes steady, her silence unbroken. For everyone else, it might have been a passing disruption, but for him, it was proof that authority is not as fixed as people believe. It can shift, it can be claimed, and it can belong to those courageous enough to challenge it. When the courtroom doors finally opened again and the world resumed its ordinary hum, those who had been inside carried something out with them that could not be left behind. The slap, the walk to the bench, the silence that shook everyone, and the way authority itself seemed to crack under her calm defiance. All of it stayed lodged in memory like a story too sharp to fade. What had been meant as routine procedure had turned into a lesson no one expected. Him, sitting among the gallery that day, felt it most of all. He hadn't just witnessed an incident, he had witnessed a shift. A moment where the very meaning of justice was rewritten before his eyes. It was easy to forget. In ordinary life, how fragile the balance of power really was. Uniforms, robes, gavels, these were meant to symbolize certainty, control, and fairness. Yet, in that courtroom, each one of those symbols had been exposed as powerless when detached from integrity. The officer's uniform hadn't shielded him from the weight of his own overreach. The judge's robe hadn't protected him from the silence that questioned his inaction. And the gavel that never struck that day became a reminder that real authority isn't measured in tools, but in the moral courage to use them justly. For him, the image that would not leave his mind was not the slap itself, but what came after, the way she sat in that chair with dignity that demanded recognition. There had been no outburst, no shouting, no wild gesture to undermine the moment. Instead, her stillness had done what no loud protest could achieve. She had redefined the space simply by existing in it, forcing everyone to confront the truth that power without justice is nothing more than intimidation. The whispers that followed her action told their own story. Some wondered aloud what punishment she might face, how the system would retaliate for her defiance. Others spoke quietly of courage, of how they had never seen anything so bold within walls built to enforce silence. But for him, the moment wasn't about what would come next. It was about what had already been proven. That authority can be challenged, and that sometimes the act of sitting down is more powerful than standing up. As he left the building, the echo of the day replayed in his head. He thought about how quickly the courtroom had turned into a stage, how every person in it became part of a play they never rehearsed. Yet it wasn't the judge, nor the officer, nor even the bailiffs who became the center of the story. It was her, the woman who had been wronged, who refused to be broken, who claimed the highest seat in the room not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. In the end, the lesson wasn't complicated. Authority is not untouchable. Power can be redefined. Silence can be louder than rage. And a single act of defiance, carried out with dignity, can transform humiliation into history. Him knew he would never forget that day, not because of the violence that began it, but because of the courage that